The evening mist rolled gently along the Rhone River as the gas lamps began their nightly ritual of illumination throughout the streets of Lyon. It was the year 1856, and the city hummed with the quiet persistence of industry, a symphony of progress played in the minor key of human endeavor. The silk looms had fallen silent for the day, their rhythmic clacking replaced by the softer sounds of evening, the clip-clop of horses' hooves on cobblestones, the murmur of voices from the cafes, and the gentle rustling of papers in the offices that lined the commercial district. In one such office, situated in a handsome stone building near the Place Bellecour, sat Monsieur Claude Beaumont, company secretary to one of Lyon's most prominent industrial enterprises. The amber glow from his oil lamp cast dancing shadows across the mahogany desk where he worked, illuminating the neat rows of ledgers, the crystal inkwell, and the stack of correspondence that awaited his attention. The scent of leather bindings mingled with the faint aroma of lamp oil and the ever-present hint of coal smoke that characterized the industrial age. Claude adjusted his spectacles, a recent necessity as the years of close work had begun to take their toll on his vision. At 43 years of age, he had spent nearly 2 decades in the service of commerce, rising from a junior clerk to his current position through a combination of diligence, intelligence, and an almost mystical ability to maintain order in the chaos of industrial administration. His salary of 4,000 francs per annum placed him comfortably in the middle tier of Lyon's commercial hierarchy, well above the 3,000 franc threshold that distinguished managers from mere clerks, yet far below the princely sums commanded by the directors and major shareholders. The office itself reflected both the dignity and the burden of his position. The walls were lined with dark wooden shelves, each bearing the weight of countless volumes, corporate statutes, meeting minutes, correspondence files, and financial records dating back to the company's founding. A portrait of Napoleon III gazed down from above the mantelpiece, a reminder of the imperial order that had brought such prosperity to Lyon's industries. The thick carpet, though showing signs of wear along the well-traveled path from door to desk, still provided a measure of comfort against the chill that seeped through the stone floors during the long winter months. As Claude dipped his pen into the inkwell, preparing to draft yet another report for the Conseil d'Administration, he reflected on the peculiar nature of his profession. The company's secretary occupied a unique position in the corporate hierarchy, neither fish nor fowl, as the English might say. He was not quite management in the traditional sense, lacking the authority to make strategic decisions or allocate significant resources, yet he was far more than a simple clerk. His role was to serve as the memory and conscience of the corporation, the keeper of its secrets and the guardian of its procedures. The company he served was one of the new breed of industrial enterprises that had emerged in the wake of the revolutionary upheavals and Napoleonic reforms. Like many Lyon businesses, it had been formed through the merger of several smaller firms, each bringing their own traditions, personalities, and conflicts to the union. The board of directors, composed of 20 elected shareholders, met monthly in the ornate boardroom on the building's second floor, where they would debate and decide upon matters of corporate policy with all the ceremony and occasional acrimony of a parliamentary assembly. Claude's workday typically began at 7 in the morning, when the first weak light of dawn filtered through the fog that often shrouded the city. He would arrive at the office to find the junior clerks already at their desks, their pens scratching industriously across ledger pages as they transcribed the previous day's transactions. The morning air would be thick with the smell of fresh ink and the coal fire that the office boy had lit in the early hours. The organizational structure of the company reflected the curious mixture of modern corporate governance and traditional French bureaucracy that characterized the industrial age. At the apex sat the director, a figure of almost monarchical authority who personally reviewed even the most minor expenditures, down to the selection of hand towels for the headquarters washrooms. Below him, the executive committee managed day-to-day operations, though their actual power was often more theoretical than practical. The real work of the company was carried out by a cadre of engineers and department heads, graduates of the prestigious state engineering institutes who brought both technical expertise and social refinement to their positions. Claude's responsibilities encompassed a vast array of duties that would seem almost impossible to a modern observer. He was responsible for maintaining all corporate records, preparing the agendas for board meetings, recording the minutes of those assemblies, managing correspondence with shareholders, overseeing the preparation of financial statements, ensuring compliance with government regulations, and serving as the primary liaison between the board and the executive management. Each of these tasks required not only meticulous attention to detail but also a deep understanding of the subtle politics that govern corporate life. The art of minute-taking, for instance, was far more complex than simply recording what was said. Claude had learned over the years to capture the essence of discussions while carefully omitting those moments of heated disagreement that might prove embarrassing if recorded for posterity. When Monsieur Marguerite had proposed the creation of a director position in November of that pivotal year, the debate had been fierce, with several board members questioning whether such concentration of power was wise or necessary. Yet in Claude's official record, the discussion appeared as a model of reasoned deliberation, with the decision emerging as the natural consensus of enlightened minds. The physical demands of the position were considerable, though different in nature from those faced by the silk workers in the factories of Croix. Long hours hunched over a desk had given Claude a permanent stoop, and his right hand bore the calluses and ink stains that marked him as surely as any craftsman's tools marked their owner. The constant strain of reading and writing by lamplight had weakened his eyes, and he suffered from frequent headaches that no amount of laudanum could entirely dispel. Yet there were compensations beyond the monetary. Claude enjoyed a status that set him apart from the ordinary clerks and bookkeepers who populated the commercial districts. He was invited to the better cafés, where merchants and professionals gathered to discuss politics and business over coffee and cognac. His opinion was sought on matters of commercial law and corporate procedure. Young clerks looked up to him as a model of what might be achieved through diligence and proper conduct. The noon hour brought a welcome respite from the morning's labors. Claude would often walk to a nearby restaurant, where a table was regularly reserved for him. The establishment, run by a widow from Burgundy, served the kind of solid, unpretentious fare that sustained the commercial classes: pot-au-feu in winter, cold meats and salads in summer, always accompanied by good bread and a glass or two of Beaujolais. The dining room would fill with a gentle buzz of conversation as merchants, lawyers, and officials discussed the news of the day. The afternoon typically brought a different set of challenges. Correspondence would arrive from the company's agents in Paris, Marseille, and sometimes even London or Frankfurt. Each letter required careful consideration and often a carefully crafted response. The international nature of commerce in the industrial age meant that Claude needed to be conversant not only in French commercial law but also in the practices and regulations of other nations. He had taught himself enough German and English to read commercial documents, though he would never trust himself to compose in those languages. The company's involvement in the silk trade, which still dominated Lyon's economy, added another layer of complexity to his work. The silk merchants operated according to their own ancient customs and practices, some dating back to the privileges granted by François in the 16th century. The elaborate system of rates and classifications, the complex relationships between merchants and weavers, the seasonal fluctuations in demand, all of these had to be understood and documented. The transformation of Lyon's silk industry during the 19th century provided both opportunities and challenges for the companies that operated within it. The introduction of the jacquard loom in the early years of the century had revolutionized production, allowing for more complex patterns to be woven with less skilled labor. Yet this mechanization had also disrupted the traditional relationships between masters and workers, leading to periodic unrest that could paralyze production for weeks at a time. Claude had witnessed firsthand the Great Uprising of 1831, when the silk workers had risen in revolt against the merchant manufacturers. Though he had been only a young clerk at the time, the memory of those turbulent days remained vivid, the sound of gunfire echoing through the streets, the sight of barricades erected across the broad boulevards, the fear that gripped the commercial classes as they watched their world seemingly crumble around them. The revolt had been suppressed, of course, and order restored, but the underlying tensions remained, a constant undercurrent in the city's industrial life. The corporate structure within which Claude worked had evolved as a response to these challenges. The dispersal of authority between directors, executive committees, and department heads was not merely an administrative convenience but a deliberate strategy to prevent any single group from gaining too much power. The director might control the purse strings, requiring approval for even 20-franc expenditures, but the factory superintendents maintained considerable autonomy in managing their workers. This delicate balance required constant negotiation and adjustment, much of which fell to Claude to document and formalize. As the afternoon wore on, Claude would often find himself preparing for the regular meetings that punctuated corporate life. The monthly board meetings required extensive preparation, gathering financial reports from the various departments, compiling statistics on production and sales, preparing summaries of important correspondence, and drafting resolutions for the board's consideration. Each document had to be copied by hand, as the company had not yet invested in one of the new copying machines that were beginning to appear in the more progressive offices. The preparation of financial statements was particularly demanding, requiring not only mathematical precision but also a certain artistry in presentation. The shareholders expected to see steady growth and healthy profits, yet the reality of industrial production was far more volatile. Strikes, mechanical failures, fluctuations in raw material prices, changes in fashion, all could dramatically impact the bottom line. It fell to Claude to present these realities in a way that acknowledged difficulties without causing panic, that celebrated successes without encouraging complacency. The corporate culture of the period reflected a curious mixture of formality and informality, hierarchy and equality. On one hand, the strict observance of titles and precedents was maintained. One always addressed the director as Monsieur le Directeur, and board members expected the deference due to their position as shareholders. On the other hand, the relatively small size of the managerial class meant that everyone knew everyone else's business, and gossip traveled through the commercial districts with remarkable speed. Claude had learned to navigate these social complexities with the same care he brought to his documentary responsibilities. He maintained cordial but formal relationships with the board members, never presuming upon their attention yet always available when needed. With the department heads and engineers, he adopted a more collegial tone, recognizing them as fellow professionals engaged in the common enterprise of industrial progress. With the clerks and bookkeepers under his supervision, he strove to be firm but fair, remembering his own days as a junior employee struggling to make his way in the world. The evening hours often found Claude still at his desk, the lamp burning lower as he worked through the endless stream of documents that industrial commerce generated. Reports from the factories needed to be reviewed and filed, 56 daily reports on expenditures alone, not counting production statistics, personnel matters, and maintenance issues. Each document had to be checked for accuracy, cross-referenced with other records, and properly categorized for future retrieval. The filing system itself was a marvel of 19th-century organization, a complex hierarchy of categories and subcategories that would seem Byzantine to modern eyes but made perfect sense within the context of industrial administration. Correspondence was filed not only by date and sender but also by subject matter, with cross-references to related documents. Financial records were organized by department, by type of expense, by accounting period, and by approval authority. Personnel files tracked not only employment history and compensation but also performance evaluations, disciplinary actions, and even personal circumstances that might affect work performance. This obsession with documentation was not merely bureaucratic fastidiousness but a practical necessity in an age before electronic communication or rapid transportation. A question about a transaction from 3 years ago might take weeks to resolve if the relevant documents could not be quickly located. A dispute with a supplier or customer might hinge on the exact wording of a contract or the precise terms of a previous agreement. The company secretary served as the institutional memory, the keeper of the corporate archive that made orderly commerce possible. The physical environment of the office reflected both the prosperity and the limitations of industrial-age commerce. The furniture was solid and well-made, designed to last for generations rather than follow the whims of fashion. The desk at which Claude worked had been crafted by a local ebonist from oak and mahogany, with dozens of small drawers and compartments for organizing papers and supplies. The chair, though lacking the ergonomic design of modern office furniture, was cushioned with horsehair and covered in leather that had acquired a rich patina through years of use. The tools of the trade were similarly traditional yet refined. Claude's pens were made from carefully selected goose quills, which he trimmed himself to achieve exactly the right point for his particular style of handwriting. The ink was mixed from powder according to a formula that balanced flow and permanence: too thin and it would fade, too thick and it would clog the pen. The paper was of good quality, with just enough texture to hold the ink without bleeding, watermarked with the company's seal to prevent forgery. Sealing wax and signets played a crucial role in securing correspondence and authenticating documents. Claude possessed several seals: his personal signet, the company seal for official documents, and special seals for confidential correspondence. The ritual of melting the wax, applying it to the folded document, and pressing the seal firmly to create a clear impression was one that never lost its satisfying quality, a physical manifestation of the authority and trust invested in his position. The development of gaslighting in Lyon had been one of the great improvements of recent decades, though not without controversy. The company du Gaz de Lyon, formed through the merger of several smaller gas companies, had gradually extended its network throughout the commercial and industrial districts. The steady, bright light of gas was far superior to candles or oil lamps for office work, reducing eye strain and extending productive hours. Yet there were those who complained about the smell, the danger of explosion, and the disruption caused by the installation of gas mains. Claude's office had been among the first to be fitted with gas lighting, a mark of the company's progressive outlook in financial resources. The fixtures were elaborate affairs of brass and crystal, designed to be ornamental as well as functional. The gentle hiss of the gas and the warm yellow light created an atmosphere that was both modern and comforting, a haven of civilization in the increasingly mechanized world of industrial production. The relationship between the commercial offices and the production facilities was complex and often fraught with tension. The factory superintendents, many of them engineers from the elite state schools, regarded themselves as the true creators of wealth, the masters of the mysterious processes that transformed raw materials into finished goods. They resented the constant oversight from headquarters, the endless requests for reports and statistics, the requirement to seek approval for even minor expenditures. Claude served as a crucial intermediary in these relationships, translating the concerns of the factories into language that the board could understand, and conveying the board's decisions in ways that would be acceptable to the proud and independent superintendents. When the director vetoed the installation of telephones connecting the factories to headquarters in 1879, citing concerns about undermining the superintendent's authority, it was Claude who had to explain this decision to frustrated board members who saw only the advantages of instant communication. The social hierarchy of Industrial Lyon was reflected in the geography of the city itself. The wealthy merchant manufacturers lived in elegant hotels, particularly in the Presque Isle, the peninsula between the Rhône and Saône rivers. The middle ranks of commerce, men like Claude, occupied comfortable apartments in the expanding districts around the Place Bellecour. The silk workers, the Canets, crowded into the tall buildings of Croixhaus, where the high ceilings accommodated the jacquard looms that were their livelihood. Claude's own living situation reflected his intermediate status. He rented a pleasant apartment on the third floor of a building in the Aisne district, close enough to the office for a comfortable walk but removed from the noise and congestion of the commercial center. The apartment consisted of a salon, a dining room, 2 bedrooms, and a small study where he often continued his work in the evenings. The furnishings were modest but respectable, a few good pieces inherited from his parents, supplemented by careful purchases made over the years. His domestic arrangements were managed by a housekeeper, Madame Dubois, a widow who came daily to clean, prepare meals, and maintain the household. This arrangement was typical for bachelors of Claude's class. Marriage required a certain level of financial security that many commercial employees did not achieve until well into middle age, if at all. Claude had once courted the daughter of a silk merchant, but the match had foundered on the rocks of economic reality. Her father expected a son-in-law who could contribute capital to the business, not merely administrative expertise. The question of marriage highlighted one of the cruel ironies of industrial society. The very qualities that made Claude valuable as a company secretary, his attention to detail, his discretion, his willingness to subordinate his own interests to those of the corporation, were not those that commanded high monetary rewards or social prestige. He earned enough to live comfortably but not enough to accumulate significant capital. He enjoyed respect but not the kind of influence that could advance a family's fortunes. Yet there were compensations in the bachelor life. Claude enjoyed a freedom that his married colleagues often envied. He could spend his Sundays as he pleased, attending Mass at the Cathedral of St. John if he felt spiritually inclined, walking in the Parc de la Tête d'Or when the weather was fine, or simply reading in his study when it was not. He had developed friendships with other bachelor professionals, a lawyer, a doctor, an engineer, with whom he would dine weekly at a restaurant known for its excellent wine cellar and discreet service. These dinners were occasions for wide-ranging conversation about topics far removed from the daily concerns of commerce. They discussed the latest scientific discoveries, debated political developments, shared their thoughts on literature and philosophy. Claude had educated himself broadly, reading not only the commercial and legal texts required by his profession but also the great works of French and European culture. His small library included volumes of Voltaire and Rousseau, the novels of Balzac and Hugo, translations of Shakespeare and Goethe. The cultural life of Lyon provided numerous opportunities for intellectual and aesthetic enrichment. The city's prosperity had funded the construction of theaters and concert halls, museums, and libraries. Claude held a subscription to the Grand Theatre, where he enjoyed both classic dramas and the newer realistic plays that were beginning to appear. He attended lectures at the Société d'économie politique, where leading thinkers discussed the great questions of industrial society, the relationship between capital and labor, the role of government in regulating commerce, the impact of technological change on traditional ways of life. The transformation of Lyon during Claude's lifetime had been remarkable. When he had arrived in the city as a young man in the 1830s, it still retained much of its medieval character: narrow, winding streets, ancient buildings crowding together, limited sanitation and lighting. Now, in the 1850s and 1860s, the city was being transformed according to modern principles of urban planning. New boulevards cut through old neighborhoods, railway stations connected Lyon to Paris and the Mediterranean, public gardens provided green spaces for recreation and contemplation. The railway in particular had revolutionized commercial life. What had once been a journey of days by coach or barge could now be accomplished in hours. Correspondence and goods moved with unprecedented speed. The commercial rhythms that had governed trade for centuries were suddenly obsolete. Claude remembered the first time he had traveled by train to Paris, the extraordinary sensation of speed, the landscape blurring past the windows, the exhilarating and slightly terrifying sense that the world was changing faster than anyone could fully comprehend. These technological changes had profound implications for the work of the company's secretary. The acceleration of commerce meant that decisions had to be made more quickly, documents prepared more rapidly, information processed more efficiently. Yet the basic tools and methods remained largely unchanged: the quill pen, the handwritten ledger, the physical seal on the folded letter. This tension between modern speed and traditional methods created constant pressure, a sense of always being behind, of never quite catching up with the relentless pace of industrial progress. The international dimension of commerce added another layer of complexity to Claude's work. Lyon's silk industry had always been internationally oriented, depending on raw silk from Italy and the Orient, selling finished products throughout Europe and beyond. But the scale and speed of international trade had increased dramatically. The company now had regular dealings with firms in London, Vienna, St. Petersburg, even New York. Each market had its own customs, both commercial and cultural, that had to be understood and respected. Claude had developed a correspondence with company secretaries in other cities, sharing information about commercial practices, legal requirements, and business conditions. These letters, written in the formal style that international commerce demanded, nevertheless contained hints of personal warmth, or recognition of shared challenges and common purposes. Through these exchanges, Claude gained a sense of being part of something larger than just his own company or even his own city, an international fraternity of commercial professionals who were collectively creating the infrastructure of the modern global economy. The question of technological innovation was a constant concern for industrial enterprises. The company's engineers were continually experimenting with new machines and processes, seeking competitive advantages in an increasingly crowded marketplace. Some of these innovations were developed in-house, the products of the engineers' own creativity and expertise. Others were licensed from inventors or purchased from specialized manufacturers. Claude's files contain hundreds of proposals from hopeful inventors, each claiming to have developed a revolutionary new device that would transform production. Evaluating these proposals required both technical knowledge and commercial judgment. Not every innovation that worked in the laboratory could be successfully scaled up for industrial production. Not every improvement in efficiency was worth the cost of implementation. The decision-making process was complex and often contentious, with engineers advocating for technical excellence while financial managers worried about return on investment. Claude's role was to document these deliberations, ensuring that the reasoning behind decisions was preserved for future reference. The patent system added another dimension of complexity. Protecting intellectual property required careful documentation of innovations, precise legal language, and often lengthy correspondence with patent offices in multiple countries. Claude had become something of an expert in patent law, able to draft applications that would withstand legal scrutiny while not revealing more than necessary about the company's proprietary processes. The management of human resources, though not yet called by that name, was another crucial aspect of industrial administration. The company employed hundreds of workers, from highly skilled engineers to manual laborers, each with their own contracts, compensation arrangements, and performance expectations. The director personally reviewed annual bonuses and promotions for even junior clerks, but the preparation of these reviews fell largely to Claude. He maintained detailed personnel files on every employee, tracking not only their work performance but also personal information that might affect their reliability, family situations, health conditions, financial difficulties, even political affiliations. This information was gathered through a combination of formal reports and informal intelligence, creating a comprehensive picture of the human resources available to the company. The question of labor relations was particularly sensitive in Lyon, given the city's history of worker unrest. The memory of the Canet revolts cast a long shadow over industrial relations. While the company's clerks and engineers were unlikely to resort to violence, they had their own forms of resistance: the carefully calibrated slowdown, the strategic interpretation of regulations, the cultivation of alternative opportunities. Managing these educated workers required a different approach than managing factory laborers, one that recognized their professional dignity while maintaining corporate discipline. Claude had observed that the most successful managers were those who understood the importance of morale and motivation. A word of praise at the right moment, a small increase in responsibility, even just the acknowledgement of good work, these cost nothing but could yield significant returns in loyalty and productivity. Conversely, harsh criticism or arbitrary decisions could poison the atmosphere of an entire department, leading to turnover and inefficiency that far exceeded any short-term savings. The financial aspects of corporate administration required not only mathematical skill but also an understanding of the broader economic forces at play. The industrial economy was subject to cycles of boom and bust that could dramatically affect a company's fortunes. The availability of credit, the price of raw materials, the demand for finished products all fluctuated according to rhythms that were only partially understood. Claude had witnessed several economic crises during his career, each one threatening the stability of even well-established firms. The Panic of 1847 had been particularly severe, with numerous bankruptcies and widespread unemployment. The company had survived, but only through careful management of resources and painful decisions about employment and production. The memory of those difficult times influenced every subsequent financial decision, creating a conservative bias that sometimes frustrated younger managers eager for expansion. The role of government in industrial affairs was another constant concern. The Second Empire under Napoleon III had generally been favorable to business interests, providing political stability and supporting infrastructure development. But government also meant regulation, taxation, and occasional interference in commercial decisions. Claude spent considerable time ensuring compliance with various governmental requirements, filing reports with the prefecture, responding to inquiries from tax authorities, maintaining records that might be inspected at any time. The relationship between business and government was complex and often ambiguous. On one hand, companies depended on government for the legal framework that made commerce possible: property rights, contract enforcement, patent protection. On the other hand, they chafed at restrictions and resented the costs of compliance. Claude had learned to navigate these waters carefully, maintaining good relationships with relevant officials while protecting the company's interests. The social responsibilities of industrial enterprises were beginning to emerge as a topic of discussion, though the concept was still foreign to many businessmen. Some progressive companies had established mutual aid societies for their workers, providing primitive forms of insurance against illness or injury. Others had built schools or libraries, recognizing that an educated workforce was more valuable than an ignorant one. These initiatives were controversial, with some seeing them as enlightened self-interest while others condemned them as paternalistic interference. Claude's own views on these matters had evolved over the years. As a young man, he had accepted without question the harsh logic of industrial capitalism, that workers were simply another factor of production, to be purchased as cheaply as possible and discarded when no longer needed. But years of observing the human cost of industrialization had softened his perspective. He had seen too many broken bodies and crushed spirits, too many families destroyed by poverty and desperation, to maintain such a callous attitude. Yet he also understood the constraints under which businesses operated. Competition was fierce and unforgiving. A company that paid its workers too much or invested too heavily in social programs would find itself undercut by more ruthless competitors. The market imposed its own harsh discipline, punishing sentiment and rewarding efficiency. This tension between human compassion and economic necessity was one of the defining characteristics of industrial society. The cultural impact of industrialization was visible throughout Lyon. The old artisanal culture of the silk workers, with its guilds and traditions stretching back centuries, was giving way to the anonymous discipline of factory production. The jacquard looms that had once been the pride of independent master weavers were now concentrated in large workshops where workers labored under strict supervision. The skills that had been passed down through generations were being replaced by mechanical processes that required little training or expertise. This transformation was not without resistance. The Canates maintained their own culture and solidarity, even as their economic independence eroded. They had their own songs, their own dialect, their own ways of understanding the world. They celebrated Saint Bonaventure as their patron, maintained mutual aid societies despite official disapproval, and periodically reminded the merchant manufacturers that the wealth of Lyon ultimately rested on their labor. Claude had occasionally ventured into the Croix district, climbing the steep streets to visit factories or investigate personnel matters. The contrast with the comfortable commercial districts was stark. The buildings were tall and narrow, designed to maximize the number of looms that could be fitted into expensive urban space. The apartments where workers lived were cramped and often unsanitary, with entire families crowded into one or two rooms. The noise of the looms was constant, a rhythmic clacking that could be heard from dawn until well after dark. Yet there was also vitality in these working-class neighborhoods that was absent from the more refined districts. The bistros and cafes were filled with animated conversation and laughter. The markets bustled with activity as housewives bargained for provisions. Children played in the streets despite the traffic and dirt. There was a sense of community, of shared struggle and mutual support, that the isolated prosperity of the middle classes could not replicate. The question of education was particularly important in the industrial age. The traditional apprenticeship system was breaking down, unable to cope with the pace of technological change and the scale of industrial production. New forms of technical education were emerging: the École de la Martinière for workers' children, the École Centrale for aspiring engineers, specialized courses in chemistry and mechanics. Claude himself had benefited from evening classes in commercial law and accounting, supplementing the basic education he had received as a child. The company supported some of these educational initiatives, recognizing that a skilled workforce was essential for maintaining competitive advantage. Scholarships were provided for promising young men to attend technical schools. Engineers were encouraged to publish papers and attend scientific conferences. Even clerks were given time to improve their skills, though this generosity had limits. Education that might enable an employee to find better opportunities elsewhere was viewed with suspicion. Claude had taken it upon himself to mentor some of the younger clerks, sharing his knowledge and experience with those who showed promise. He remembered his own early struggles, the confusion and uncertainty of navigating corporate hierarchies, the difficulty of learning unwritten rules and informal expectations. A word of guidance at the right moment could save years of fumbling in the dark. These mentoring relationships were rewarding but also poignant. Claude saw in these young men the ambition and energy he had once possessed, the belief that hard work and dedication would inevitably lead to success. He tried to temper their expectations without crushing their spirits, to prepare them for the compromises and disappointments that industrial life inevitably brought. Some would rise to positions of responsibility, others would remain forever in subordinate roles, and there was no reliable way to predict which would be which. The technological marvels of the age continued to proliferate. The electric telegraph had revolutionized long-distance communication, reducing the time for messages between Lyon and Paris from days to minutes. Photography was beginning to be used for commercial purposes, documenting products and facilities. There were rumors of even more fantastic innovations: machines that could record and reproduce sound, artificial illumination that surpassed even gas in brilliance, perhaps even vehicles that could travel without horses or rails. Claude viewed these developments with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Each innovation brought opportunities but also disruption. The telegraph, for instance, had accelerated the pace of business correspondence to an almost unbearable degree. Where once there had been time for careful consideration of important decisions, now responses were expected almost immediately. The pressure to keep up with the speed of electrical communication was intense and unrelenting. The preservation of corporate memory in this rapidly changing environment was one of Claude's primary concerns. As technologies and practices evolved, there was a danger that important knowledge would be lost. Why had certain decisions been made? What had been learned from past failures? What agreements and understandings govern relationships with suppliers, customers, and competitors? Without careful documentation, this institutional wisdom would disappear, leaving future managers to repeat the mistakes of the past. Claude had developed elaborate systems for capturing and organizing this knowledge. Beyond the formal minutes and official correspondence, he maintained private notebooks where he recorded observations, insights, and informal understandings. These volumes, written in his careful hand, constituted a shadow archive of corporate history, capturing nuances that official documents could not contain. The question of succession weighed heavily on his mind as the years passed. Who would replace him when he could no longer fulfill his duties? The skills required for the position were not easily taught. The combination of technical knowledge, social intelligence, and psychological resilience that effective administration demanded. Several junior clerks showed promise, but none had yet demonstrated the full range of capabilities necessary for the role. The problem was compounded by the changing nature of corporate administration. The methods and practices that had served Claude well were already becoming obsolete. Younger managers spoke of scientific management, of standardized procedures and mechanical efficiency. The personal touch, the individual judgment, the accumulated wisdom of experience, these were increasingly seen as impediments to progress rather than valuable assets. Claude sometimes wondered what would become of men like himself in this brave new world of industrial efficiency. Would there still be a place for the patient accumulation of knowledge, the careful cultivation of relationships, the subtle navigation of complex social and commercial networks? Or would they be swept aside by the relentless logic of mechanization, reduced to mere cogs in an ever more complex industrial machine? These philosophical musings would occupy him during the quiet hours of the evening, when the office had emptied and only the gentle hiss of the gas lamps disturbed the silence. He would sit at his desk, surrounded by the accumulated documents of a lifetime's work, and contemplate the strange journey that had brought him to this point. From a young clerk full of ambition to a middle-aged administrator bearing the weight of institutional memory, it had been a path neither straight nor predictable. The city outside his window continued its own transformation. The glow of gas lamps traced the new boulevards that Baron Haussmann's disciples had carved through the ancient fabric of Lyon. The smoke from countless factory chimneys merged with the river mist to create the characteristic atmosphere of industrial prosperity. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of a train whistle announced another arrival or departure, another link in the chain of commerce that bound Lyon to the wider world. As the evening deepened into night, Claude would finally close his ledgers and cap his inkwell. The walk home through the gaslit streets was a time for reflection and transition, leaving behind the concerns of commerce and returning to the simpler pleasures of private life. The city at night had a different character, quieter, more mysterious, filled with shadows and suggestions rather than the harsh clarity of daylight. His apartment would be warm and welcoming, the fire laid by Madame Dubois before her departure, a simple supper waiting under covers on the dining table. Claude would eat slowly, savoring the honest flavors of regional cooking, perhaps accompanied by a glass of wine from the vineyards that still survived on the hills surrounding the city. After dinner, he might read for an hour or two a novel, a work of history, sometimes even poetry when the mood struck him. Sleep, when it finally came, was deep and restorative. The physical exhaustion of long hours at a desk combined with mental fatigue from constant concentration to produce a profound weariness that even the occasional nightmare about missing documents or miscalculated figures could not entirely disturb. And in the morning, the cycle would begin again: the early rise, the walk to the office, the endless stream of papers and decisions and responsibilities. This was the life of a company secretary in Industrial Lyon, neither heroic nor tragic, but filled with its own quiet dignity and purpose. Claude Beaumont was not a captain of industry whose name would be remembered in history books. He would build no great monuments, found no dynasties, leave no lasting mark on the physical landscape of the city. But in his careful maintenance of corporate order, his preservation of institutional memory, his navigation of the complex social and economic currents of industrial society, he played an essential role in the great transformation that was reshaping not just Lyon but the entire world. The industrial age demanded many sacrifices from those who lived through it. For the workers in the factories, it meant the loss of traditional crafts and the harsh discipline of mechanized production. For the old aristocracy, it meant the erosion of hereditary privilege and social deference. For men like Claude, it meant a life suspended between worlds, too educated to find satisfaction in manual labor, not wealthy enough to join the ranks of the true bourgeoisie, forever managing other people's enterprises without ever truly owning anything of significance themselves. Yet there were also rewards, subtle though they might be. The satisfaction of problems solved, of order imposed on chaos, of contributing to something larger than oneself. The intellectual stimulation of engaging with new ideas and technologies. The social connections that provided both professional advantage and personal enrichment. The sense of participating in an historical moment of unprecedented change and possibility. As Claude aged, his perspective on these matters evolved. The fierce ambition of youth gave way to a more philosophical acceptance of life's limitations. The desire for wealth and status was replaced by an appreciation for stability and respect. The dream of revolutionary change yielded to an understanding of the value of incremental improvement. He had not become the great man he had once imagined, but he had become something perhaps more valuable: a competent, reliable, and ethical administrator who helped maintain the delicate machinery of industrial commerce. The younger generation might mock the cautious conservatism of men like Claude, their insistence on proper procedures and formal protocols, their resistance to change and innovation. But without such men, the Industrial Revolution would have collapsed into chaos. Someone had to maintain the records, enforce the rules, preserve the agreements that made complex commercial relationships possible. Someone had to remember why things were done a certain way, what had been tried and failed, what promises had been made and must be kept. In his own quiet way, Claude was a guardian of civilization itself, not the grand civilization of art and literature, but the mundane civilization of commercial order that allowed society to function. Every properly filed document, every accurately recorded transaction, every carefully drafted contract was a small bulwark against the entropy that constantly threatened to overwhelm human endeavors. The transformation of Lyon during these decades was mirrored in Claude's own transformation. He had arrived as a provincial youth, eager but unformed, knowing little of the world beyond his native village. Through years of patient observation and careful study, he had made himself into something new: a professional administrator, a man of the industrial age, shaped by and shaping the commercial culture of one of Europe's great manufacturing centers. The silk industry that dominated Lyon's economy was itself a metaphor for this transformation. What had once been an artisanal craft, passed down through generations and governed by guild traditions, had become an industrial enterprise governed by the laws of capital and competition. The beautiful fabrics that emerged from Lyon's factories might look similar to those produced centuries earlier, but the social and economic relationships that created them were entirely different. Claude had witnessed this transformation from multiple perspectives. In the corporate archives, he could trace the evolution from small family firms to joint stock companies, from personal relationships to contractual obligations, from traditional practices to scientific management. In the city streets, he could see the physical manifestation of change: the new factories, the workers' housing, the railway stations, the department stores that catered to the growing middle class. The human cost of this transformation was significant, though often hidden behind statistics and financial reports. For every successful entrepreneur who built a fortune in silk or chemicals or machinery, there were dozens of failed ventures, hundreds of displaced artisans, thousands of workers laboring in conditions that shortened their lives and crushed their spirits. Claude's files contained evidence of this suffering, though it was rarely acknowledged directly: accident reports, requests for medical leave, petitions for assistance that revealed the desperation lurking beneath the surface of industrial prosperity. Yet there was also genuine progress, improvements in human welfare that could not be denied. The gaslighting that illuminated streets and homes, making the city safer and extending productive hours. The railway networks that connected Lyon to the wider world, bringing new opportunities and ideas. The schools and hospitals funded by industrial wealth, providing education and medical care to those who previously had no access to either. The gradual emergence of labor protections and social insurance, primitive though they might be, acknowledging that workers were human beings deserving of some minimal consideration. Claude had learned to hold these contradictions in balance, neither celebrating industrial progress uncritically nor condemning it wholesale. The world was changing, had changed, would continue to change, and no amount of nostalgia for a simpler past could alter that reality. The question was not whether to accept industrialization but how to manage it, how to minimize its destructive effects while maximizing its potential benefits. This pragmatic philosophy guided his daily work. When reviewing contracts, he looked for terms that would be fair to all parties, not just advantageous to his employer. When managing personnel matters, he tried to balance the company's need for efficiency with the workers' need for dignity and security. When dealing with government officials, he sought arrangements that would serve both public and private interests. It was a delicate balance, often impossible to achieve perfectly, but worth striving for nonetheless. The international dimension of Lyon's commerce added another layer of complexity to these considerations. The silk that made the city prosperous came from Italian and Asian suppliers who operated according to different cultural norms and business practices. The finished products were sold throughout Europe and increasingly to America, each market with its own preferences and requirements. Claude's work required him to be a cultural translator as well as a commercial administrator, bridging differences in language, law, and custom. This exposure to international commerce had broadened Claude's perspective in ways that would have been impossible for someone of his background in earlier generations. He had corresponded with merchants in Constantinople and New York, had reviewed contracts written under British common law and Napoleonic code, had learned to appreciate the different approaches to commerce practiced in different cultures. The world had become smaller and more interconnected, linked by threads of silk and telegraph wire. As the night deepened and the gas lamps burned lower, the city outside Claude's window settled into its nocturnal rhythm. The factories that operated night shifts continued their mechanical breathing, the rhythmic sound of machinery carrying through the still air. The Seine and Rhone rivers flowed quietly through their channels, bearing barges loaded with coal and raw materials. The workers' districts quieted as exhausted laborers sought what rest they could before another day's toil. The commercial districts emptied except for the night watchmen making their rounds, checking locks and watching for fires. In his apartment, Claude prepared for sleep with the methodical routine that characterized all his activities. He wound his pocket watch and placed it on the nightstand, hung his clothes carefully in the wardrobe, performed his evening ablutions with the precision of long habit. As he lay in bed, listening to the distant sounds of the city, he often reflected on the strange trajectory that had brought him to this point, a man of middle years, neither rich nor poor, neither powerful nor powerless, but occupying an essential position in the complex machinery of industrial commerce. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new documents to file, new problems to solve. The board would meet to discuss expansion plans or dividend distributions. Correspondence would arrive from distant markets bringing news of opportunities or crises. The endless stream of reports from factories and departments would need to be reviewed and filed. Young clerks would need guidance, senior managers would need information, the director would need the subtle support that made his authority effective. But tonight, in these quiet hours between one day's labor and the next, Claude could rest in the knowledge that he had fulfilled his duties, had maintained the order that commerce required, had contributed his small part to the great enterprise of industrial civilization. It was not a heroic life, perhaps, but it was a necessary one. And in its own quiet way, it contained its own forms of satisfaction and meaning. The city slept, or seemed to sleep, though the great engines of industry never truly rested. Somewhere, coal was being shoveled into furnaces, maintaining the steam pressure that would drive tomorrow's production. Somewhere, night shift workers tended their machines, keeping the great beast of industrial production fed and functioning. Somewhere, other company secretaries sat at other desks, managing other documents, maintaining other small islands of order in the vast sea of commercial activity. And in the morning, when the sun rose over the hills of Lyon, casting its light on the smoke-stained buildings and the gleaming new boulevards, on the ancient cathedral and the modern factories, on the homes of the wealthy and the tenements of the poor, Claude Beaumont would rise, dress, and make his way once again to his office, to take up once again the burden and the privilege of his position, to continue the patient work of administration that made industrial civilization possible. The story of Industrial Lyon was written in many hands, in the bold strokes of entrepreneurs and engineers, in the careful script of clerks and accountants, in the calloused hands of workers who operated the machines and hauled the goods. Claude's contribution to this story might seem small, his neat handwriting filling ledgers that would be forgotten, his careful minutes recording meetings that would fade from memory. But without such men, without their patient dedication to order and procedure, the grand edifices of industrial commerce would crumble into chaos. As sleep finally overtook him, Claude's last conscious thoughts were not of greatness achieved or opportunities missed, but of simpler things, the satisfaction of a well-written report, the pleasure of a problem solved, the quiet pride of professional competence. These might seem like small consolations for a life spent in service to other people's enterprises, but they were real and they were his. And in the end, perhaps that was enough. The industrial age had created new forms of work, new types of workers, new relationships between human beings and the enterprises they served. The company secretary was one of these new creatures, neither owner nor laborer but something in between, a manager of information and processes, a keeper of institutional memory, a guardian of corporate order. It was a role that had not existed in the pre-industrial world and might not survive the next wave of technological change. But for now, in this moment of history, it was essential. Claude Beaumont slept, and the city of Lyon continued its restless transformation around him, the silk looms silent for the night but ready to resume their rhythmic dance with the dawn, the factories breathing their steady breath of steam and smoke, the rivers flowing eternally toward the sea, carrying with them the products of human industry and ambition. And in offices throughout the city, ledgers waited to be filled, documents waited to be filed, the endless paperwork of commerce waited for the patient hands of company secretaries to give it order and meaning. The morning would come soon enough, bringing with it all the challenges and responsibilities of industrial life. But for now, in these quiet hours of the night, there was peace. The great machine of commerce paused, if only briefly, allowing its human components a moment of rest before the cycle began again. And in that pause, in that moment of stillness, the true nature of industrial society revealed itself, not as an inhuman mechanism grinding forward regardless of human cost, but as a deeply human enterprise, shaped by human choices, sustained by human effort, given meaning by human purpose. This was the reality that Claude understood, perhaps better than the entrepreneurs who commanded or the workers who labored. From his position in the middle of the hierarchy, he could see both the grand ambitions and the mundane details, the noble aspirations and the petty corruptions, the genuine progress and the terrible costs. He could see how it all fitted together, or failed to fit, how order emerged from chaos through patient effort and careful documentation. And tomorrow, he would return to his desk, take up his pen, and continue the work of maintaining that order, one document at a time, one decision at a time, one day at a time, until his strength failed or the world changed beyond recognition. It was not a glamorous destiny, perhaps, but it was his, and he had made his peace with it long ago. The clock tower of the Hotel de Ville chimed the hour, its bronze voice carrying across the sleeping city. 3 o'clock in the morning, that strange, suspended time when night was deepest but morning already beginning to stir in the consciousness of those whose work demanded early rising. In a few hours, the bakers would begin their work, filling the streets with the warm aroma of fresh bread. The market vendors would arrive with their carts of vegetables and fruits, their voices calling out the day's offerings. The factory whistles would sound, summoning workers to another day of labor. But for now, silence reigned, broken only by the occasional footstep of a night watchman or the distant bark of a dog. The industrial city, for all its noise and activity during the day, could achieve a remarkable peace in these pre-dawn hours. It was as if the great machine needed these moments of rest to gather strength for the exertions to come. In his dreams, Claude sometimes found himself back at the beginning of his career, a young man standing before the imposing doors of his first employer, clutching his letter of recommendation and trying to calm his racing heart. In these dreams, he possessed both the energy of youth and the wisdom of experience, able to navigate the challenges that had once seemed so overwhelming with the confidence that came from years of practice. Other nights, he dreamed of a future he would never see, a Lyon transformed beyond recognition, where machines performed the work of clerks and secretaries, where information traveled instantly across continents, where the careful handwriting and patient filing that defined his life had become obsolete. These dreams were neither nightmares nor fantasies but strange visions of possibility, reminders that the world would continue to change long after he was gone. The silk trade that had made Lyon's fortune was already beginning its slow decline, though few recognized it yet. Competition from Asian producers, changes in fashion, the development of artificial fibers, all would contribute to the eventual transformation of the city's economy. But that was a story for another generation to navigate. Claude's generation had built the industrial infrastructure, had created the commercial practices and corporate structures that would endure even as the specific industries rose and fell. The human relationships that sustained this commercial world were as delicate and complex as the silk threads that emerged from Lyon's looms. Trust had to be earned through years of reliable performance. Reputation, once damaged, was almost impossible to repair. A single mishandled document, a carelessly worded letter, a breach of confidentiality, any of these could destroy a career built over decades. Claude had seen it happen to others. A chief accountant who had invested company funds in a private speculation, hoping to replace them before anyone noticed. A correspondence clerk who had sold commercial intelligence to a competitor. A junior secretary who had forged his superior's signature on a contract. Each had thought themselves clever, each had believed they could manage the deception, and each had eventually been discovered and disgraced. The temptations were real and constant. Claude himself handled documents worth fortunes, had access to information that could be invaluable to speculators or competitors. A word whispered in the right ear about an upcoming merger, a glimpse of financial reports before they were made public, a warning about impending difficulties, any of these could be converted into money or influence. But Claude had learned early that integrity was not just a moral virtue but a practical necessity. Once trust was lost, it could never be fully regained. This understanding shaped his mentorship of younger clerks. Beyond teaching them the technical skills of documentation and correspondence, he tried to instill in them an appreciation for the ethical dimensions of their work. They were not just processing papers but maintaining the trust that made commerce possible. They were not just recording transactions but preserving the integrity of the commercial system itself. The physical environment of the office reflected these values. Everything had its proper place, every document its appropriate file, every procedure its established protocol. This was not mere pedantry but a recognition that order and predictability were essential for managing the complexity of industrial commerce. In a world where a single misplaced contract could lead to costly litigation, where a delayed letter could mean a lost opportunity, where an error in calculation could result in bankruptcy, precision was not just desirable but essential. Yet within this rigid structure, there was room for humanity. Claude knew the names of all the junior clerks, inquired about their families, remembered their particular interests and concerns. He understood that productivity came not from harsh discipline but from creating an environment where people felt valued and respected. A clerk who was worried about a sick child would make errors, one who felt secure and supported would work with greater care and dedication. The changing seasons brought their own rhythms to commercial life. Spring was a time of renewed activity, as the winter's planning gave way to implementation. Summer brought its own challenges, the heat that made the offices stifling, the August exodus when half of Lyon seemed to depart for the countryside or the coast. Autumn was perhaps the busiest season, as companies rushed to complete the year's business before winter set in. And winter itself was a time of consolidation and planning, of reviewing the year's results and preparing for the next cycle. Claude had lived through nearly 20 of these annual cycles, each similar in its broad outlines but unique in its specific challenges and opportunities. He had seen boom years when profits soared and expansion seemed limitless. He had endured crises when the very survival of the company was in question. Through it all, the work continued, the documents were filed, the correspondence maintained, the records preserved. The technological changes that would eventually transform office work were already beginning to appear. The typewriter, still a curiosity in most offices, promised to revolutionize correspondence. The telephone, despite the director's resistance, would eventually make instantaneous communication commonplace. Adding machines would take over the calculations that currently occupied teams of clerks. Photography would supplement and eventually replace hand-drawn technical illustrations. Claude viewed these innovations with a mixture of curiosity and concern. They would certainly make some aspects of work easier and more efficient. But they would also eliminate many of the skills that he had spent years developing. What value would beautiful handwriting have in a world of typewritten documents? What need would there be for mental arithmetic when machines could calculate faster and more accurately? What role would remain for the company secretary when information could be transmitted and stored by mechanical means? These questions had no easy answers, and Claude was honest enough to admit that he might not like the answers when they came. But he also understood that resistance to change was futile. The Industrial Revolution had taught that lesson clearly enough: those who adapted survived and prospered, those who resisted were swept aside. The challenge was to maintain what was valuable from traditional practices while embracing beneficial innovations. The international exhibitions that periodically showcased industrial progress provided glimpses of this future. Claude had attended the Universal Exhibition in Paris in 1855, marveling at the displays of machinery and manufactured goods from around the world. The message was clear: the age of isolation was over. Companies that wanted to succeed would need to think globally, to compete not just with local rivals but with enterprises from every industrialized nation. This global perspective influenced even routine administrative tasks. When drafting contracts, Claude had to consider not just French commercial law but international agreements and conventions. When maintaining correspondence files, he had to accommodate multiple languages and cultural styles. When preparing financial reports, he had to account for currency fluctuations and international payment systems. The human element remained constant despite these technological and commercial changes. People still needed to trust each other for commerce to function. Agreements still needed to be negotiated and documented. Disputes still needed to be resolved through patient discussion and compromise. The tools might change, but the fundamental human activities of cooperation and exchange would continue. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, the city started its gradual awakening. The earliest risers were already stirring, the bakers beginning their ovens, the street sweepers starting their rounds, the market gardeners bringing their produce from the surrounding countryside. Soon the tempo would increase as more people joined the daily dance of urban life. Claude stirred in his sleep, some internal clock alerting him that morning was approaching. In another hour, he would rise, perform his morning ablutions, dress in his carefully maintained professional attire, and make his way to the office. The familiar routine was comforting in its predictability, a personal ritual that prepared him for the day's challenges. The walk to work was one of the day's small pleasures, a time to observe the city's transformation from sleepy quiet to bustling activity. He would pass the flower sellers setting up their stalls, the cafe owners arranging their chairs and tables, the shopkeepers removing shutters and arranging window displays. Each person was beginning their own daily routine, contributing their own small part to the life of the city. The office building would be quiet when he arrived, with only the night watchman to greet him. Claude enjoyed these early morning hours, when he could work without interruption, clearing his desk of routine matters before the day's complications began. The morning light would gradually strengthen, eventually making the gas lamps unnecessary. The junior clerks would arrive, hanging their coats and settling at their desks with the rustle of papers and scratch of pens. By mid-morning, the office would be in full operation, the steady rhythm of commerce in all its mundane glory. Letters would be written and received, documents would be filed and retrieved, decisions would be made and recorded. It was not dramatic work, but it was necessary work, the administrative skeleton that supported the muscular activities of production and trade. The noon meal would provide a brief respite, a chance to step away from the desk and engage with the wider world. The afternoon would bring its own challenges and opportunities. And eventually, as the sun declined toward the western horizon, another day's work would draw to a close. The ledgers would be balanced, the correspondence completed, the files updated. Claude would make his way home through streets now familiar after years of travel, returning to his quiet apartment and his simple evening routine. This was the pattern of his life, repeated day after day, year after year, with small variations but essential consistency. Some might find it monotonous, but Claude had discovered a deep satisfaction in the rhythm of routine, in the gradual accumulation of completed tasks, in the knowledge that he had fulfilled his responsibilities with competence and integrity. The larger meaning of his work might be debatable. He was not creating great art or literature, not making scientific discoveries, not leading armies or governing nations. He was simply maintaining the administrative infrastructure that allowed commerce to function. But without that infrastructure, without the patient work of countless company secretaries and clerks and bookkeepers, the industrial economy would collapse. Perhaps that was meaning enough to be a small but essential part of something larger, to contribute one's particular skills to the collective enterprise of civilization. Not everyone could be a hero or a genius, but everyone could strive to do their work well, to treat others with respect, to maintain their integrity in a world that often rewarded its absence. As full consciousness returned, Claude opened his eyes to find the familiar ceiling of his bedroom touched by the gray light of dawn. Another day was beginning, bringing with it all the usual demands and occasional surprises. He rose from his bed, feeling the familiar aches that came with middle age, but also the anticipation of engaging once again with the work that had defined his adult life. The morning routine unfolded with practiced efficiency, washing with cold water from the porcelain basin, shaving with the straight razor that had been his father's, dressing in the conservative but well-made clothing that marked his professional status. Each action was performed with the same careful attention that he brought to his work, a manifestation of the order and discipline that structured his existence. Breakfast was simple but sustaining: bread and butter, coffee with milk, perhaps a piece of cheese or a boiled egg. Madame Dubois had left everything prepared, as she always did, a small miracle of domestic organization that Claude never took for granted. He ate slowly, reading the morning newspaper, absorbing the news of political maneuverings and commercial developments that might affect his company's interests. The walk to the office was particularly pleasant this morning, with a light breeze carrying away the usual industrial smoke and revealing glimpses of the hills surrounding Lyon. The city was awakening around him, shutters opening, chimneys beginning to smoke, the sound of wheels on cobblestones growing steadily louder. It was a scene he had witnessed thousands of times, yet it never entirely lost its charm. The office building stood ready for another day's work, its solid stone facade a reassuring symbol of permanence in a changing world. Claude climbed the familiar stairs, his footsteps echoing in the stairwell, and unlocked the door to his office with the large brass key he had carried for so many years. The room was exactly as he had left it the evening before, papers neatly stacked, pens cleaned and arranged, everything in its proper place. He lit the gas lamps against the morning gloom, their warm light bringing the office to life. The day's correspondence was already waiting, delivered by the early post. Claude sorted through it with practiced efficiency, identifying what required immediate attention and what could wait. A letter from the company's agent in Marseille reporting on shipping difficulties. An inquiry from a potential customer in Vienna. A notice from the prefecture regarding new safety regulations. Each would require a carefully considered response. As he began to work, Claude felt the familiar satisfaction of engaging with tasks that he understood completely, of applying skills honed over decades to problems that, while sometimes complex, were never entirely beyond his ability to resolve. This was his domain, his contribution to the great enterprise of industrial commerce. It might not be glamorous, but it was real and it was his. The morning progressed with its usual rhythm. Junior clerks arrived and set to work at their copying and calculating. The chief accountant stopped by to discuss a discrepancy in the previous month's figures. A delegation from one of the factories arrived to petition for new equipment. Through it all, Claude maintained the calm efficiency that was his hallmark, addressing each issue in turn, ensuring that proper procedures were followed, that everything was documented, that the corporate machinery continued to function smoothly. This was the reality of industrial administration, not the savage mockery suggested by the satirists and social critics who saw only exploitation and dehumanization, but rather a complex human enterprise where people of different backgrounds and abilities worked together, however imperfectly, to create something larger than themselves. It was not perfect, far from it, but it was real and it was necessary. As the morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the river mist, Lyon revealed itself in all its industrial glory, the factories producing their silk and chemicals and machinery, the offices managing the flows of capital and information, the workers and managers and owners all playing their parts in the great drama of economic transformation. And in one modest office, Claude Beaumont continued his patient work, one document at a time, maintaining the order that made it all possible. The story of the company's secretary in Industrial Lyon was not one of dramatic triumph or tragic defeat, but of quiet persistence in the face of constant change. It was the story of countless individuals who found themselves caught between the old world and the new, who adapted as best they could to circumstances they could neither fully understand nor control, who maintained their dignity and purpose despite the pressures and contradictions of industrial life. And as another working day unfolded in all its familiar complexity, as the great machine of commerce continued its relentless operation, as the silk looms clacked and the telegraphs clicked and the trains whistled their arrivals and departures, Claude Beaumont sat at his desk, pen in hand, continuing the work that gave meaning to his days and structure to his life. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The gentle rhythm of routine, the soft sounds of a city at work, the quiet satisfaction of tasks completed and duties fulfilled, these were the elements that composed his life, that would carry him through this day and the next and all the days that remained to him. In the end, perhaps that was what industrial civilization truly meant, not the grand abstractions of progress and efficiency, but the simple reality of people doing their work, maintaining their relationships, preserving what order they could in a world of constant change. And so the day continued, and the work continued, and life in Industrial Lyon continued, carrying Claude Beaumont and countless others forward into a future they could not fully imagine but would help to create through their patient, persistent, everyday efforts. The company's secretary at his desk, the workers at their looms, the merchants in their counting houses, the engineers with their plans and calculations, all were threads in the great tapestry of industrial transformation, each essential, each contributing to the whole. As you drift off to sleep, dear listener, let the quiet rhythms of Claude's world carry you into peaceful slumber. The scratch of his pen on paper, the gentle hiss of the gas lamps, the distant sound of silk looms, the murmur of voices in the commercial district, all these sounds of a world long past but not entirely foreign, a world where people much like ourselves struggled and strived, worked and rested, faced their challenges with whatever courage and competence they could muster. Rest now, as Claude would rest at the end of his long day, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges but also new opportunities, that the work would continue but so would life, that in the patient performance of our daily duties we find not only sustenance but meaning. The industrial city sleeps, and we sleep with it, carried gently into dreams by the steady heartbeat of commerce and community, of human endeavor and human endurance. Good night, and peaceful dreams.